The Middle Ages are often romanticized as an age of knights in shining armor, grand castles, and noble quests. We imagine tournaments, banquets, and the glory of medieval chivalry. But beneath that glittering surface, the medieval world was also a place of unrelenting hardship, fear, and cruelty. It was an age where justice could be brutal, punishments public, and torture not only accepted, but celebrated as a tool of law, faith, and authority. To understand why torture became such a defining feature of medieval justice, we need to first step into the mindset of the time. Life in the Middle Ages was short and uncertain. Disease could strike at any moment, war was never far away, and even small crimes could carry terrible consequences. People believed the world was filled with sin, demons, and unseen forces. The church warned that every action had eternal consequences, and rulers believed that maintaining control required harsh displays of power. In such a world, punishment wasn't just about justice. It was about fear, spectacle, and obedience. And torture? Torture was a performance. It wasn't always about finding the truth. It was about showing the power of kings, inquisitors, and judges. When someone was stretched on the rack or paraded through the town square in the stocks, it wasn't only the victim who suffered, it was everyone watching who walked away thinking, "This could happen to me if I step out of line." Torture was theater, designed to keep society in order. But we also have to remember that medieval people didn't think about truth the way we do. Today we know that torture doesn't reliably produce confessions. People will say anything to end their suffering. But in the Middle Ages, truth was believed to be bound up with the soul, and pain was seen as a way to strip away lies. If someone confessed under torture, that was taken as proof of guilt, not as a desperate attempt to survive. Torture, in that sense, was thought of as a divine tool. Pain would force the sinner's soul to reveal itself. The most terrifying part? Many torture devices were deliberately designed not to kill. Death was almost merciful compared to what these machines could do. Instead, victims were kept alive, bones shattered, joints ripped apart, flesh pierced, blood drained, so that the suffering could last longer and the spectacle could endure. It's important to realize that torture wasn't hidden behind dungeon walls the way we sometimes imagine. Yes, interrogations often happened in shadowy chambers, but executions, punishments, and humiliations were public events. Crowds gathered in the town square to watch people beaten, burned, or broken on the wheel. Children were sometimes brought along as lessons in obedience. Pain wasn't private. It was woven into the fabric of medieval life. And the devices themselves, they were horrifying not only for the pain they caused, but for the cold imagination behind them. These weren't crude instruments thrown together in a rush. Many were carefully engineered, sometimes even decorated, made with the same skill as weapons or church bells. A rack could stretch a body inch by inch. A bridle could clamp a mouth shut with intricate ironwork. A wheel could smash bones in carefully measured blows. The artistry made the cruelty worse. It showed that this wasn't mindless violence. It was intentional, calculated suffering. But torture wasn't only about punishing criminals. It was a weapon in the great battles of faith and politics. During the Inquisition, torture was used to force confessions of heresy. During witch hunts, women accused of sorcery were subjected to unthinkable pain until they confessed to impossible crimes. In wars and rebellions, captured enemies could expect a slow and spectacular end. Their suffering turned into propaganda. Torture was as much about controlling belief as it was about enforcing law. Still, it's important not to imagine the medieval world as one endless horror show. Not every village had an Iron Maiden hidden in the basement, and not every criminal was broken on a wheel. Torture was often reserved for serious crimes, for political enemies, or for times when fear needed to be reinforced. But when it was used, it was unforgettable, and its reputation spread far beyond the victims themselves. The truth is that medieval torture sits at the crossroads of two sides of the Middle Ages. On one hand, it was a time of faith, law, and order. On the other, it was an age of cruelty, fear, and superstition. Torture reflects both. It was seen as legitimate justice and as divine truth-seeking. But to us, it reveals just how fragile life was and how absolute power could become. And so, as we journey deeper into this world of medieval torture, we'll uncover the most infamous devices ever created. Machines that could rip joints apart, crush bones, pierce flesh, and humiliate the human spirit. Some were very real, others may have been exaggerated or even invented later, but all of them captured the imagination, shaping how we picture medieval cruelty today. So sharpen your courage, because in the next part, we'll step into the torture chamber and witness one of the most feared devices of all time, the rack. A machine that could stretch the human body until it snapped, and a symbol of medieval terror that echoed across centuries. If there is one torture device that has come to symbolize the cruelty of the Middle Ages, it is the rack. The very mention of the word can send a shiver down the spine. It is perhaps the most infamous machine of pain ever created, a device designed with chilling precision to stretch the human body past its limits. To understand why the rack terrified people for centuries, we need to step into the torture chamber and witness exactly how it worked. The rack was a large wooden frame, often shaped like a bed, but with a horrifying twist. At either end were rollers, heavy wooden cylinders. A victim would be laid flat on the frame, wrists tied with ropes at one end, ankles bound at the other. Once secured, the torturer would begin to crank the rollers. Slowly, agonizingly, the ropes would tighten, pulling the body in opposite directions. At first, the victim's arms and legs would stretch painfully, but the more the rollers turned, the worse it became. Joints would strain, ligaments tear, muscles snap. Eventually, shoulders, elbows, hips, and knees could be wrenched out of their sockets, leaving the body grotesquely dislocated. The cruelty of the rack lay in its control. It didn't kill quickly. The torturer could stop at any moment, loosening the ropes to prolong suffering, then tightening again. A few turns of the crank could cause unbearable agony without tearing a single joint. More turns could leave a prisoner crippled for life. The rack allowed torment to be inflicted with precision, drawing out the pain hour after hour. Victims often described a sensation of being pulled apart, their bodies betraying them with cracks, pops, and tearing sounds. Imagine the terror, not only of the pain itself, but of hearing your own body breaking piece by piece. And even if a prisoner was released before being destroyed, the damage could be permanent. Muscles torn beyond repair, joints ruined, limbs left useless. Survival didn't mean freedom. It meant a lifetime of suffering. The rack wasn't used casually. It was typically brought out for serious crimes: treason, heresy, witchcraft, or conspiracy. It was a favorite of inquisitors and political courts. Perhaps the most famous victim of the rack was Guy Fawkes, the man behind the gunpowder plot in England in 1605. After his capture, he was racked until his body was shattered. His once bold handwriting became an unrecognizable scrawl on his confession. The rack quite literally broke him. And Guy Fawkes wasn't alone. Across Europe, countless others were subjected to the same fate. During the Spanish Inquisition, suspected heretics faced the rack as inquisitors demanded they confess. In England and France, it was used against political enemies, rebels, and supposed witches. The rack became a symbol not just of physical pain, but of the terrifying power of those in charge. But perhaps the most chilling fact is that sometimes the rack didn't not even need to be used. Its presence alone was enough to make people confess. Prisoners would be shown the device, told how it worked, and warned what would happen to their bodies. Many broke down instantly, begging to confess before a single crank was turned. The rack, then, was as much a psychological weapon as a physical one. Its reputation was so dreadful that the sight of it could crush the will of even the strongest. Some versions of the rack were modified to add even more horror. Spiked rollers were occasionally fitted, so that as the ropes pulled tighter, the victim's back was pressed against iron teeth. Others were designed with iron bars that could smash bones while stretching the body. In certain cases, red-hot coals or torches were held under the victim as they were pulled, adding the agony of burning flesh to the torment of dislocation. The basic design was simple, but its variations were endless, each one more brutal than the last. For medieval authorities, the rack had a symbolic power. It represented control, order, and divine justice. If someone confessed on the rack, it was seen as proof that God had forced the truth out of them. Pain wasn't cruelty. It was justice, an unmasking of lies. But for the victims, it was pure hell, a world of agony that seemed worse than death. And yet, in the strange logic of the Middle Ages, the rack wasn't intended primarily as execution. It was an in-between device, a tool to prepare someone for trial, to extract names of conspirators, or to ensure obedience. Death often came later, in the form of hanging, burning, or beheading. The rack was the prelude, the nightmare before the end. Today, the rack has taken on a legendary status. It appears in movies, novels, and nightmares as the ultimate symbol of medieval cruelty. Whether or not every detail of its use has been exaggerated over time, its impact is undeniable. The thought of being stretched until your body gives way is universally terrifying, and that's why the rack remains etched in history as one of the darkest inventions of all. But as horrifying as the rack was, it was not alone. Other devices promised pain just as brutal, if not worse. Some pierced the body with spikes, others shattered bones, and some combined physical torture with public humiliation. In the next part, we'll explore one of the most infamous and controversial torture devices of all, the Iron Maiden. A coffin of spikes that may never have existed, but which has come to define the terror of medieval punishment. When people think of medieval torture, one of the first images that comes to mind is the Iron Maiden. This towering coffin lined with spikes has become an icon of medieval cruelty, depicted in films, haunted houses, and horror stories. The idea of being locked inside a metal sarcophagus pierced through by sharp iron points and left to die in the dark is a nightmare so vivid it hardly seems real. But here's the twist. The Iron Maiden may never have existed in the Middle Ages at all. Let's start with the legend. The Iron Maiden is said to have been a human-shaped cabinet, usually tall enough to enclose an adult. Its door or doors were covered with sharp metal spikes on the inside. A victim would be forced inside, the doors swung shut, and the spikes would pierce their body. But here is the cruel genius. The spikes were supposedly placed in such a way that they would not immediately kill. Instead, they would stab into flesh, arms, legs, and torso while avoiding vital organs. The result? The victim was impaled in multiple places, bleeding slowly, suffering over hours or even days before finally succumbing. The very thought of it is horrifying. Imagine standing upright, locked in darkness, unable to move, every breath pressing your body against cold iron spikes. Pain constant, escape impossible. The Iron Maiden wasn't designed for swift execution. It was built for prolonged agony, death by slow bleeding, shock, and terror. But here's the problem. Historians have long debated whether the Iron Maiden was a real medieval device, or whether it was a gruesome invention of later centuries. The first clear descriptions of an Iron Maiden don't appear until the 18th and 19th centuries, when old spiked coffins and relics were assembled from medieval fragments to shock audiences in museums. In fact, the most famous Iron Maiden of Nuremberg was put together in the 1800s as a curiosity, using old ironwork and imagination. So, was the Iron Maiden real? Probably not in the way we imagine it today. But that doesn't mean spiked torture devices never existed. Medieval Europe certainly used spiked chairs, cages, and masks. There were iron contraptions designed to hold a victim in place while they were pierced, crushed, or burned. It's very possible that stories of these devices evolved over time, merging into the legendary image of the Iron Maiden. Whether fact or myth, the Iron Maiden captured something essential about the way people imagine the Middle Ages: cruel, dark, and terrifying. It became a symbol of sadistic punishment, even if it wasn't actually used in the period. And in a way, the myth may be just as powerful as the reality, because what's more frightening than a device so cruel that people believed it must have been real? But the Iron Maiden wasn't the only spiked torture device that haunted the medieval imagination. There were also spiked coffins and cages, which were very real. In these punishments, victims were locked into metal enclosures, sometimes human-shaped, sometimes simple iron cages, and suspended in public view. Unlike the Iron Maiden, these didn't always have spikes on the inside. Instead, the torment came from exposure. Victims were left hanging in the elements, unable to move, sometimes for days. Birds pecked at their flesh. The sun burned them by day. The cold froze them by night. Hunger and thirst slowly killed them while the public watched. Some cages did include spikes, ensuring that even the smallest movement brought agony. Imagine being trapped in a narrow iron prison where you could neither sit nor lie down, your skin pressed against jagged points, your suffering turned into a spectacle. The psychological terror of these devices was often worse than the physical pain. To be locked away, unable to move, hearing the crowd jeer outside, knowing death was coming but arriving painfully slowly, that was perhaps the most terrifying punishment of all. The victim's body became a warning sign, literally displayed for others to see. This is what happens to traitors, heretics, or criminals. Even if the Iron Maiden itself wasn't used in the Middle Ages, the idea of enclosing someone in a prison of spikes fits perfectly with the spirit of medieval punishment. Torture wasn't always about efficiency. It was about imagination, about creating new ways to extend suffering, and about using fear as a weapon. It is also worth remembering that much of what we think of as medieval torture was passed down through centuries of storytelling, exaggeration, and propaganda. Some Protestant writers in later centuries exaggerated the cruelty of Catholic inquisitors, inventing or embellishing devices to shock audiences. Likewise, 19th century museums of curiosities loved displaying terrifying medieval artifacts, even if they were assembled from scraps and myths. The Iron Maiden became famous because it was believable. In a world already filled with racks, wheels, and burnings, why not a coffin of spikes? And that's why the Iron Maiden still captures the imagination today. Even if it was never truly used, the image is unforgettable, a symbol of suffering and darkness, of the cold ingenuity of pain. It has become one of the defining icons of medieval cruelty, and its legend continues to live on in our culture of horror and fascination with the macabre. But if the Iron Maiden was a legend, the next device was all too real. It didn't just imprison the victim, it broke them bone by bone until their body was shattered beyond recognition. In the next part, we'll turn to one of the most infamous public execution methods of the Middle Ages, the breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel, a device so feared that its very name became a symbol of destruction. If the rack stretched the body and the Iron Maiden pierced it, the breaking wheel shattered it. Known also as the Catherine wheel, this was one of the most infamous and terrifying methods of execution in medieval Europe. Unlike some torture devices that took place in hidden chambers, the breaking wheel was often a public spectacle. It wasn't just a way to kill. It was a way to make death itself a performance of agony. The breaking wheel was exactly what its name suggests: a giant wooden wheel, sometimes from a cart, mounted horizontally on a stand or vertically like a gruesome stage. The condemned person was tied spread eagle across the wheel, their arms and legs stretched out along the spokes. Then came the executioner, carrying a heavy iron bar, hammer, or club. With brutal precision, he would smash the victim's limbs one by one, arms, legs, hands, feet. Each blow broke bones, twisted joints, and turned flesh into pulp. The goal wasn't to kill instantly, quite the opposite. The executioner aimed carefully to break bones while avoiding vital organs. The result was a living body, mangled beyond recognition, with shattered limbs hanging limp. Once every major bone was broken, the victim was left strapped to the wheel, a ruined figure displayed for all to see. Sometimes, to prolong suffering, the executioner would deliver what was called the mercy blow, a strike to the chest, neck, or head, to finally end it. But in many cases, no mercy was given. The condemned was left alive on the wheel, where they could suffer for hours or even days. The horror didn't end there. The wheel itself became part of the punishment. After the breaking was complete, the wheel might be hoisted upright and placed on a pole, turning the victim into a gruesome display. Crows and dogs would circle, drawn by the scent of blood. The victim's family, neighbors, and enemies would all see the broken body left for the elements. The wheel became a public warning. This is what happens to those who defy authority. The breaking wheel was often reserved for the worst crimes. Murderers, traitors, and rebels could expect such a fate. Because it was so slow and so spectacular, it was considered one of the harshest forms of execution available. In some cases, the condemned was given a chance to repent or confess before the ordeal began, but repentance didn't save them from the wheel. It only promised them heaven after their body was destroyed. The name Catherine Wheel comes from a legend. According to Christian tradition, St. Catherine of Alexandria was condemned to die on such a wheel in the 4th century. But when she touched the device, it miraculously shattered, saving her from the torture. In art and symbolism, the wheel became associated with her martyrdom. Ironically, though, the legend only reinforced the device's fame, and the wheel remained in use for centuries as one of the most feared punishments. Descriptions of the breaking wheel in historical records are chilling. In some accounts, victims lingered for days, still alive but unable to move, begging for death. Travelers wrote about wheels along roadsides, with bones of criminals still clinging to the wood, a grim reminder to passers-by. In Germany, France, and other parts of Europe, the wheel became a staple of execution grounds. It was both justice and theater, turning death into a spectacle for the community. But the cruelty wasn't only physical. The breaking wheel was designed to humiliate. Being broken in public stripped away all dignity. The victim became an object of horror and pity, their body displayed like a piece of butchered meat. Families were often forced to watch. Children might be brought to witness, as a lesson in obedience. The shame of the wheel lived on long after the victim died, staining their memory and frightening the living. What's especially striking is that the wheel wasn't abandoned quickly. It was used well into the early modern period, long after other torture devices had faded. In some places, the last recorded use of the breaking wheel was as late as the 19th century. Its power lay not only in the physical suffering it caused, but in the way it etched fear into the collective imagination. Today, the Catherine wheel survives as a symbol in language and culture. Fireworks shaped like spinning wheels are sometimes called Catherine wheels, a bizarre echo of the torture device's name. And in stories and films, the wheel remains one of the most brutal punishments ever conceived. The breaking wheel shows us just how far medieval justice could go in turning pain into performance. It wasn't enough to kill someone. The body had to be destroyed, displayed, and remembered. Death became a warning sign nailed to the conscience of society. And yet, even the wheel was not the limit of medieval imagination. Other devices were created that inflicted not only bone-breaking pain, but also targeted the most vulnerable parts of the human body, forcing open the mouth, crushing the head, or stretching delicate flesh in ways too cruel to imagine. In the next part, we'll turn to some of these instruments of horror, the pear of anguish, the boot, and other crushing and piercing devices that proved medieval cruelty had no shortage of imagination. If the rack and the wheel shattered the body on a grand scale, other devices took a more intimate approach. Some targeted specific parts of the body, the mouth, the head, the hands, or the feet. They didn't just cause pain, they humiliated, disfigured, and left permanent scars. And then there were the elements themselves, fire and water, harnessed as tools of terror. Together, these methods showed just how creative and cruel medieval torturers could be. Let's begin with one of the strangest devices of all, the pear of anguish. Shaped like a metal fruit, it was made of 4 iron petals connected at the base by a screw mechanism. When closed, it was small enough to be inserted into the mouth, or in some accounts, into other orifices depending on the crime. Once inside, the screw was turned, and the pear slowly opened, the petals spreading outward like a blossoming flower. The result was excruciating. In the mouth, it could tear the cheeks, crack the jaw, and rupture the throat. In the body, it could shred delicate flesh beyond repair. The pear wasn't designed to kill immediately. It was meant to cause pain, humiliation, and often permanent injury. Victims might be left unable to speak, eat, or even breathe properly afterward. In some cases, the device was used symbolically, for example, placed in the mouth of blasphemers or liars, a literal punishment for sinful speech. Whether every detail about its use is historically accurate is still debated, but the very existence of such a device reveals the cruel imagination at work in the medieval period. Now imagine something simpler, but no less brutal. The boot. At first glance, it might seem like an ordinary piece of footwear, but in the hands of torturers, it became a nightmare. Victims' legs were placed into iron or wooden frames shaped like boots. Then wedges were hammered between the boot and the leg, crushing flesh, muscle, and bone. With each blow, the pressure increased until bones snapped and blood oozed from the skin. In some cases, hot coals or boiling liquids were poured inside the boot, turning it into a cauldron of agony. The boot had many variations across Europe. In Scotland, a version known as the Spanish boot was notorious for shattering legs beyond repair. Elsewhere, simpler versions used ropes and sticks to crush shins. Whatever the form, the result was the same: mangled legs, permanent disability, and a prisoner broken in both body and spirit. Another infamous device was the head crusher. This consisted of a metal cap placed over the head and a plate under the chin. A screw mechanism connected the two. As the torturer turned the screw, the plate pressed upward while the cap pressed downward, crushing the skull inch by inch. Teeth shattered, jaws broke, eyes bulged from their sockets. In some versions, the pressure could even force brain matter through the skull. Few devices capture the sheer intimacy of torture more vividly than this one: the slow destruction of a person's face while they remained alive and conscious. But torture didn't always require elaborate machines. Sometimes the elements of nature were enough. Fire was one of the oldest tools of pain. Red-hot irons could sear flesh, branding criminals or burning wounds. Victims might be forced to hold glowing metal or stand barefoot on heated plates. In some cases, metal chairs were heated until they glowed, and prisoners strapped to them roasted alive. Fire was both punishment and symbol. It was seen as a cleansing force, burning away sin. That's why burning at the stake became one of the most infamous executions, reserved for heretics and witches. Water, too, became an instrument of torment. One method was simple: endless buckets of water poured onto the face, simulating drowning. Victims struggled for breath, choking and panicking, believing death was seconds away. Another variation was known as the water cure. A funnel was forced into the mouth, and water poured until the stomach swelled painfully. Sometimes gallons were forced in, stretching the body to the brink of rupture. Unlike the rack or the wheel, water torture left no external scars, making it both effective and insidious. And then there was the drip. Victims were strapped down while cold water dripped steadily onto their forehead. It sounds harmless, almost laughable, but the repetition could drive a person to madness. Hours or days of dripping created unbearable psychological stress, convincing the victim they were being slowly pierced through the skull. This shows another side of medieval cruelty. Torture wasn't only about the body, but also about breaking the mind. Together, these devices and methods reveal something chilling about the medieval world. Pain wasn't random. It was carefully thought out, engineered, and varied. Some tortures destroyed the body instantly. Others stretched suffering over hours. Some focused on humiliation, while others targeted the most sensitive parts of human anatomy. And all of them served the same purpose: to control, to intimidate, and to display power. It's easy to think of these methods as belonging to a barbaric age long gone. But we should remember that many of these ideas, fire, water, crushing, have been reinvented in later centuries, even in modern times. Torture didn't die with the Middle Ages. It evolved, adapted, and survived. The medieval period simply gave us some of the most memorable and terrifying examples. But even after all this, the imagination of medieval torturers wasn't finished. Beyond racks, wheels, pears, and boots, there were still devices designed not only to destroy the body, but to humiliate it in front of others. Public shame was often worse than private pain. In the next part, we'll explore these tools of psychological torment: the pillory, the stocks, and the scold's bridle, devices that turned suffering into a public show and humiliation into one of the cruelest punishments of all. Among all the devices of pain in the Middle Ages, some were terrifyingly simple. They didn't require giant wheels, elaborate ironwork, or spiked coffins. Sometimes all it took was a rope, a pulley, and gravity. The strappado, also known as reverse hanging or suspension torture, was one of the most widespread and feared methods of interrogation. It left little blood, no spectacular wounds, but the pain it inflicted was indescribable and often permanent. So, how did it work? The victim's hands were tied tightly behind their back, usually at the wrists. Then a rope was attached to their bound arms and threaded through a pulley high above, often fixed to a ceiling beam or a sturdy frame. The prisoner was hoisted upward by their arms until they were hanging, their entire body weight pulling on their shoulders. At first, it might have felt like being stretched. But within moments, the real torment began. The shoulders, forced into an unnatural position, began to dislocate. Muscles tore, ligaments snapped, and joints popped from their sockets. The victim was left dangling helplessly, their own body weight ripping them apart from within. Screams echoed through the chamber as the pain intensified. And the cruelest part? The torturer could raise and lower the victim at will, prolonging the suffering, letting the joints pop back into place only to be torn again. Variations made the strappado even worse. Sometimes, heavy weights were tied to the victim's feet, adding more force, increasing the tearing of joints. In other cases, the rope was suddenly released so the victim dropped part way toward the ground, only to be stopped with a violent jerk before hitting the floor. This jerk amplified the dislocation, sometimes breaking bones outright or snapping tendons in a single motion. It was torture by shock, designed to surprise the body into destruction. The strappado was especially favored during the Inquisition. Suspected heretics, witches, and anyone accused of defying the church could find themselves hanging by their arms in this agonizing posture. For inquisitors, it was a practical tool. It didn't leave obvious external wounds, so a victim could be presented at trial without looking as though they had been tortured. But the damage inside was devastating. Victims were often left crippled for life, unable to use their arms again. Accounts from history reveal just how common this method was. In Florence, Italy, the strappado was so widely used it was nicknamed la corda, the rope. Prisoners were said to confess almost instantly when faced with the dangling agony. In Spain and Germany, variations of the suspension were described in witch trial records, where women accused of flying or consorting with the devil were hoisted into the air until their arms gave way. It was seen not just as punishment, but as proof, the idea being that only a guilty soul could endure such pain without confessing. Psychologically, The strappado was also devastating. Imagine being dragged into a cold chamber, forced to watch as the rope was threaded through the pulley. You know what's coming. You see others broken, shoulders dangling uselessly at their sides. The anticipation alone was enough to make many prisoners collapse into confessions before the torture even began. And yet, the strappado was only one form of suspension torture. Across Europe, there were other variations, each designed to inflict pain through the simple act of hanging. Some involved tying the victim by the thumbs and suspending them until the joints tore. Others tied the victim upside down, letting blood rush to the head until unconsciousness or madness followed. In certain cases, prisoners were suspended just inches above the ground, forcing them to strain constantly to relieve the pressure. It was a slow, cruel game of endurance. What made suspension so effective was its simplicity. Unlike the rack or wheel, it didn't require an elaborate setup. A rope, a beam, and strong arms were enough. That meant it could be used almost anywhere. Dungeons, castles, even in the open air during military campaigns. Its portability made it a universal weapon of fear. But its simplicity also made it unpredictable. Sometimes victims died quickly, their bodies unable to withstand the strain. Other times they lingered, crippled but alive, their shoulders permanently twisted, their arms useless. Survivors were often marked for life, their disfigurement a living testimony to what they had endured. For those in power, this was useful. A broken body was as effective a warning as a broken confession. The strappado also reveals something about the mindset of the medieval torturer. These were not random acts of violence. They were carefully chosen methods, tailored to break both body and will. By inflicting maximum pain with minimum blood, torturers created victims who could still speak, still sign documents, still appear in public trials. In a world obsessed with appearances, that mattered. The torture chamber left its mark not in scars, but in broken spirits and shattered joints. The cruelty of suspension lies in how close it comes to being ordinary. Hanging from a rope doesn't sound as dramatic as being crushed in an Iron Maiden or broken on a wheel. But the agony it created was no less real, and often more enduring. It was invisible torture, hidden in joints and bones, a slow destruction felt from the inside out. And yet, as horrifying as the strappado was, it wasn't the end of medieval cruelty. Pain didn't always have to come from ropes and screws. Sometimes, humiliation could hurt even more. Public shame could destroy a person's life as surely as broken bones. In the next part, we'll step away from the secret chambers of torture and into the public square, where stocks, pillories, and iron bridles turned ordinary punishment into public theater. Torture, after all, wasn't only about physical suffering. It was about humiliation, spectacle, and the slow death of dignity. Not every medieval punishment was about ripping bones from sockets or shattering limbs with iron bars. Sometimes the most devastating cruelty came not from physical destruction, but from shame. The Middle Ages were a deeply communal society. People lived in villages and towns where reputation meant survival. To be humiliated in front of your peers was often worse than death. And medieval authorities knew this all too well. They designed punishments that turned humiliation into torture, making the condemned suffer in body, mind, and spirit. Let's begin with one of the most iconic instruments of shame, the pillory. This wooden frame, usually set up in a busy town square, held the victim's head and hands in place between two hinged boards. Once locked in, the prisoner was stuck, unable to move, unable to defend themselves, their face exposed to the world. Crowds would gather, and that's when the real torment began. People hurled insults, rotten vegetables, mud, even stones. Children spat. Neighbors mocked. Sometimes animals were driven to bite or scratch the helpless figure. The pillory wasn't just a punishment. It was a performance. The community itself became the executioner, delivering humiliation blow by blow. A few hours in the pillory could leave someone bruised, bloodied, and psychologically destroyed. And the damage didn't end when the boards were unlocked. The shame followed the victim long after, a public stain on their reputation. For a medieval villager, that could mean ruined business, broken relationships, and lifelong disgrace. Then there were the stocks, a close cousin to the pillory. Instead of securing the head and hands, the stocks locked the ankles. Victims were forced to sit or lie in the dirt, often for hours or days. Once again, the public was invited to jeer, taunt, and torment. Rain, sun, and cold added to the misery. If the pillory attacked dignity from above, the stocks crushed it from below, literally placing people on the ground like animals. For women accused of gossiping, nagging, or speaking out of turn, there was a particularly cruel invention, the scold's bridle, also known as the brank. This was an iron mask or cage fitted over the head, often with a spiked plate that pressed into the mouth or tongue. Once locked on, the woman could neither speak nor eat properly. Sometimes the bridle included bells, ensuring everyone heard her coming as she was paraded through the streets. The humiliation was intense. The message was clear, silence was enforced, and defiance punished. What makes these punishments so disturbing is that they blurred the line between torture and theater. Pain wasn't inflicted in secret chambers. It was staged in the center of town, with an audience. The community was encouraged to participate, to laugh, to scorn, to throw things. The victim's suffering became entertainment, a reminder of what happened to anyone who broke the rules. In this way, humiliation became a weapon as sharp as any blade. But humiliation wasn't always about contraptions. Sometimes the punishment was in the sentence itself. Offenders might be forced to parade naked through the streets, carrying heavy stones or wearing signs declaring their crimes. Others were forced to crawl on their knees before church doors, begging forgiveness in front of neighbors. The idea was simple: strip away dignity, and you break not just the body but the soul. Psychological torture could also come from the anticipation of pain. Imagine being shown the rack, the wheel, or the pear of anguish, hearing every detail of how your body would be torn apart. Many prisoners confessed before a single blow was struck. The fear of pain was often as effective as pain itself. Torturers understood this, and sometimes the mere threat of a device did the work. In some cases, prisoners were forced to watch others being tortured or executed. This was no accident. It was part of the punishment. Seeing the wheel crush bones or flames consume flesh planted terror in the mind. It told the victim exactly what awaited them if they resisted, and for the wider public, it reinforced obedience. The message was brutal but effective. This could be you. Humiliation also extended beyond the victim to their family. A man pilloried for theft didn't suffer alone. His wife and children bore the shame too. They might be shunned, mocked, or denied trade. Punishment wasn't only about the individual. It was about making an example, ensuring the stain spread as far as possible. Perhaps the most terrifying aspect of psychological torture in the Middle Ages was its invisibility. Bruises healed, bones sometimes mended, but the humiliation remained, lodged in memory, whispered by neighbors, retold for years. A single day in the pillory could define someone's life forever. It was torture without blood, cruelty without chains, and in some ways, it was more effective than any rack or wheel. Of course, these punishments also reveal the darker side of community life. Medieval towns weren't just places of faith and fellowship. They were also arenas of control, where suffering became public entertainment. People laughed at the pilloried thief, threw stones at the shamed adulterer, and watched the bridled woman parade by. It's easy to imagine ourselves as horrified spectators, but in truth, these crowds were often eager participants. Humiliation was not only a weapon of the authorities, it was a pastime of the people, and yet even humiliation had its limits. For those accused of the gravest crimes, heresy, witchcraft, treason, the punishment went far beyond stocks and pillories. These were not crimes punished by shame alone. They demanded fire, steel, and blood. In the final part of our journey, we will look at the ultimate punishments of the Middle Ages, executions designed to end lives in ways so terrifying they became legends. From burning at the stake to being boiled alive, these punishments remind us that in the medieval world, death was not simply an ending, it was a spectacle of power. So far, we've explored the racks, wheels, spikes, ropes, and humiliations of the Middle Ages. But all of these tortures were, in many ways, preludes. They were designed to extract confessions, humiliate the guilty, or soften the spirit before judgment. The final act, however, was execution. And in the medieval world, executions weren't just about ending a life. They were about putting on a spectacle, sending a message that would echo through the minds of all who watched. These punishments were designed to be worse than death itself. Perhaps the most infamous was burning at the stake. To modern ears, the phrase is familiar, often connected to witches. But in medieval Europe, it was a common punishment for heresy and treason. The condemned would be tied to a wooden stake, surrounded by bundles of kindling. As the flames were lit, the fire crept slowly upward. Clothing caught first, then flesh, then hair. The victim screamed as skin blistered, muscles cooked, and smoke filled their lungs. Sometimes the fire was built small, prolonging the agony as the condemned roasted alive. In other cases, executioners showed a grim mercy by strangling the victim before the flames took them. But either way, the burning was public. Entire towns gathered to watch, the smell of charred flesh mingling with the cries of the dying. Another punishment reserved for the gravest crimes was hanging, drawing, and quartering, a sentence infamous in England. The condemned, often accused of treason, was dragged to the place of execution behind a horse. There they were hanged by the neck, but cut down before death came. Still alive, they were disemboweled, their entrails burned before their eyes. Then the body was hacked into 4 pieces, or quartered, and the remains displayed at city gates as a warning. It was one of the most brutal executions in history, a deliberate attempt to erase not just the person, but their very memory. Elsewhere, punishments were just as horrifying. In parts of Europe, criminals could be boiled alive in vats of oil, water, or even wine. The victim was lowered in slowly, prolonging the suffering as skin peeled away in layers. In Germany and the Low Countries, breaking on the wheel often ended not in lingering death but in the final mercy blow, yet sometimes mercy was denied, and the victim was left to rot for days, a living corpse exposed to the world. Some punishments were highly symbolic. Beheading, for instance, was considered an honorable death, often reserved for nobles. A single stroke of the sword or axe was meant to make the end swift, but executioners were not always skilled. Some victims endured multiple blows before their heads finally came off, turning honor into horror. In contrast, commoners might face hanging, a slow strangulation in public that left bodies swaying as grim reminders. But perhaps the cruelest executions were those designed to use fear itself as a weapon. The condemned might be forced to watch their fellow conspirators die first, knowing their turn was next. Or they might be paraded through the streets, jeered at by the crowd, forced to confront not only death, but complete loss of dignity. Death was not private. It was theater, and the audience was all of society. It's tempting to think of these executions as relics of a brutal past, but they carried a logic that made sense in their time. Medieval rulers didn't just want to eliminate criminals or heretics, they wanted to control entire populations. To see someone burned alive was to feel the weight of authority in your very bones. To watch a body torn apart was to internalize fear. Pain was not only for the condemned, it was for everyone watching. And yet, even in the darkest moments, people found ways to resist. Some went to the stake singing hymns, their faith unbroken. Others cursed their captors with their final breath. Their courage turned executions into legends, inspiring future generations. Saints and martyrs were often born in flames, their deaths remembered not as defeats, but as triumphs. In this way, medieval cruelty sometimes backfired, creating heroes out of victims. As we reflect on these horrors, it's easy to recoil, to condemn the Middle Ages as nothing but barbaric. But these punishments remind us of something deeper: the human obsession with power, control, and spectacle. The tools may change, racks, ropes, flames, but the impulse remains: to terrify others through the suffering of a few, to use fear as a form of governance. Today we live in a different world, but the echoes of medieval torture linger in our culture. We see them in horror films, in dark legends, in the very language we use. On the rack, in the hot seat, trial by fire. All of these sayings trace back to a time when torture was real, when suffering was staged for all to see. The Middle Ages may be behind us, but their shadows remain. And so we come to the end of our journey into the darkest corners of the medieval past. From racks that pulled bodies apart, to wheels that shattered bones, to flames that consumed lives, these punishments show us the terrifying extremes of human imagination. They remind us that history is not only castles and kings, but also cruelty and fear. And while we may never face the rack or the stake ourselves, the stories of those who did continue to haunt us, echoes of a time when death itself was turned into a spectacle worse than death.